Do you ever feel like you're way behind, like everybody else got the memo about life and you're still figuring out the basics? When my first son was born, myself and my wife were living in a mobile home. That's a single wide trailer to you folks across the pond. I felt very behind bringing our child home to a caravan, no house, no money, and no real prospect of earning any. I know what it feels like to measure yourself up against expectations and come up short. And that feeling of being behind, it followed me everywhere. But here's what I've come to realize, and this might change how you feel about your entire story. You're not behind, you're being built. I've been a perpetual beginner all my life. A beginner filmmaker, a beginner boyfriend, a beginner brewer, a beginner event professional, a beginner businessman, a beginner farmer, beginner writer, and now a beginner YouTuber. I always stood out, but I was always behind. Or so I thought. And some of you might know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you've been through trauma, burnout, or depression, and you feel like you've lost time. Everyone else had their 5-year plans while you were just trying to figure out how to get out of bed. Maybe you're tired of being the only one who's always starting over. The career changer, the late bloomer, the one whose life doesn't look like anyone else's. Anyone else want to put professional beginner on their CV? Let me know in the comments. I'd say there's more of us than we think. But here's the thing about always being the beginner. You end up with skills that nobody else has. You learn to adapt, to start fresh, to see things differently because you've been on the outside, looking in so many times. Think about it this way. You don't pour concrete and then move in the next day. There's scaffolding, noise, delay, mess. That's how buildings go up. Even St. Paul's Cathedral, or even the Golden Gate Bridge. So why are we surprised when God builds people the same way? Construction zones are messy. Healing takes time. And maybe the reason your life doesn't look like everyone else's is because you're on a different assignment entirely. I used to drive by building sites and think, God, that's an absolute state. But then I'd come back 6 months later and see something beautiful where the chaos used to be. The mess wasn't random, it was necessary. The scaffolding around your life, that's not evidence that you're broken. That's evidence that there's something worthwhile being built. God prepares people in obscurity for impact, in clarity. If this is hitting you different already, would you mind hitting that like button? It genuinely helps more people find content like this. And I think there's a lot of folks who need to hear they're not behind. Let me tell you about Moses. This was a man who had a great start in life and should, by all accounts, have been ahead. He was a gifted child, had a palace education, rich, all the advantages, but he wasn't ahead. He spent 40 years in obscurity, tending sheep in the desert, thinking he missed it, thinking he blew it. Now, 40 years is a long time to feel like you're wasting your life. That's a whole career. That's watching your friends get promoted, get married, buy houses, have kids, grow up, while you're in the middle of nowhere with sheep. But we all know how Moses' story ends. He needed to learn how to wander in the desert, that's for sure. He wasn't wasting time. He was learning survival skills for himself and eventually for the entire nation. What if Moses hadn't failed early on? What if he'd stayed in the palace, kept his position, never murdered that Egyptian, never fled? He would have been a prince trying to lead slaves through a desert he'd never navigated. God used those 40 years to teach him how to find water where there wasn't any, how to survive when there's no map, how to lead when you can't see where you're going. That was his construction season, being built for something he couldn't even imagine yet. Even when Moses finally got his calling, when he stood before that burning bush, he didn't feel ready. He felt like a failure with a speech impediment, trying to talk to Pharaoh. But God wasn't looking for polished, he was looking for prepared. Moses wasn't behind. He was being built in the wilderness for a wilderness assignment. Here's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. God isn't just fixing you, He's constructing something sacred in your life. Paul says, you are God's building. Not a tent that gets packed up and moved, not a shed that serves its purpose and then gets forgotten. A temple. And here's the thing about temples. They can't be rushed. Solomon's temple took 7 years to build. 7 years. And that was with unlimited resources and thousands of workers. But here's the mad thing about how they built it. The stones were cut off-site. All the real shaping, all the real work of fitting each piece exactly right happened away from the temple site. So when they brought the stones together, the Bible says there was no sound of a hammer or of a chisel. The construction was silent because the real work had already been done in obscurity. Maybe that's where you are right now, being shaped off-site, and it feels like you're missing the main event. Like everyone else is at the temple while you're stuck at the quarry. But what if the quarry is where the real work happens? Peter calls us living stones, being built into a spiritual house. A stone alone, it looks unfinished, useless, just a rock in someone's hand. But placed in the right context, with the right foundation, it carries weight that matters. Maybe you felt like a brick left in the yard, discarded, forgotten, but you're not waste material. You're waiting for your placement. And that placement doesn't happen randomly. It's a process of fitting, shaping, sometimes breaking off the rough edges. What looks like a delay might just be God fitting you for your purpose in something bigger than you can see. For a long time, I thought I was falling behind, drifting, failing, moving from one thing to another like I couldn't stick at anything. But God never said, hurry up and get there. He said, I'm building something sacred. All those skills I learned in different industries and different phases of my life, the filmmaker skills, the building knowledge, the business experience, the writing, even the failing, none of it was wasted. They're all pulling together now for a greater purpose I couldn't have planned. Your pain wasn't wasted. Those detours that made no sense at the time, they were blueprints, and your odd, winding path that looks nothing like anyone else's, that's evidence that you're being set apart. What if you're being prepared for something no one else has been assigned to? See, the world wants to convince you that there's one path to success, one timeline that matters. Graduate at 22, married by 25, house by 28, kids by 30, promoted by 35. But what if that conveyor belt life, it isn't for everyone? What if some of us are being built for assignments that require a different kind of preparation? The people who change things, who bring hope to hopeless places, who speak to parts of life that polite society doesn't want to acknowledge, they're usually the ones who have been through something, who've learned in dark places, who've been shaped in obscurity. That construction noise you're hearing in your life, it's not chaos, it's craftsmanship. That mobile home where I brought up my son, I used to be embarrassed about it, thought it meant I was behind, thought it meant I had failed him before he even got started. But you know what I learned in that caravan? How to make the most of small spaces, how to be grateful for what you have instead of resentful for what you don't, how to focus on what matters when everything else is stripped away. Every skill I thought I was wasting, every path I thought was a dead end, every time I had to start over, it was all preparing me for this, for speaking to people who felt behind, for understanding what it's like not to fit the mold. You can't fake that kind of credibility. You can't manufacture empathy for the lost and the late starters. Here's what I want you to understand. God is a master builder, not a quick fix contractor cowboy. When Jesus called his disciples, he didn't choose the religious elite who had it all figured out. No, he chose fishermen, tax collectors, political zealots, people who were outside of the system, people who knew what it meant to feel overlooked. And then he spent 3 years building them. 3 years of confusions, mistakes, misunderstandings. Peter denied him. Thomas doubted. James and John wanted to call down fire on people. But Jesus wasn't trying to make them perfect. He was trying to make them useful. The same God who took 40 years to prepare Moses, who spent 7 years building his temple, who invested 3 years in 12 ordinary men, that same God is working on you. Listen, if you want to support more content like this, real faith for real people dealing with real struggles, check out my Patreon. It's how I keep this independent and honest, and it means I can keep making content for people who need it most. Subscribe if you're tired of surface level faith content and want to hear something with actual substance. We're building a community of people who know God works in the mess, not just on the mountaintops. And if this video spoke to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it, because there's somebody else in your life right now who feels behind, and they need to know that they're actually being built. You're not behind. You're not delayed. You're being shaped off-site for something sacred. And all those beginnings, they weren't failures, they were foundations. You're not behind. You're becoming dangerous to the darkness. The construction isn't finished yet, but it's not supposed to be. You're being built. My name's Jacob, and this might be church.